My name's Richard Ross-Langley. I'm a software consultant. I'm currently running a social enterprise looking after charitable enterprises in Hertfordshire. In my final year at college, I was doing a psychology course, and to do the statistics on it, I used Fred Hoyle's IBM 360 in Cambridge, which meant loading a large deck of cards. I think it was chi-squared test, and got the results out of that. I wanted to modify it a little to see what the tendency was as opposed to these straight statistics, and that was probably the first program I'd written just to adjust it. I was a student apprentice with Joseph Lucas in Birmingham, and they gave me a month in each department, total of about 10 months, and I was doing things like technical drawing, chemical analysis, sintering, and the things that I most enjoyed were welding and computing. So in the next vacation, when I went back to do a bit more work, I was doing programming, which I thoroughly enjoyed. One program I wrote was statistical analysis of transistors, trying to find out at which points various dopings had an effect. I left university with a degree in natural sciences, and I was interested in computing, and I'd effectively majored in psychology. So I wanted a job that reflected all of that, and I found a job as a research scientist for English Electric Leo Marconi computers in Acton. Handwriting recognition. I wrote a program. The only available language was COBOL, so I wrote a program in COBOL to analyse effectively the bit maps of digits that people wrote, and tried to deduce how you could analyse which number it was from the bit patterns, and decided in the end that cluster analysis was the right answer. It was an unusual organisation because there were 4 of us in the department, and the 2 juniors were me and a guy called Tom Teasdale, who's now a professor in Denmark. And there wasn't that much work, so we effectively had to invent our own work besides doing the Times crossword. And when Tom went to resign, I hope he doesn't mind me saying this, at the end of the interview, as he was leaving, the boss said, "Excuse me, what's your name?" And he was tempted to give my name. Soon after that, I got a job with the Midland Bank and spent 5 years there, starting off programming and then moving rapidly into technical support, and then operating system specialist. And I was very interested in software and became a consultant, roaming around the world doing IT support for mainframes. I'm now effectively doing the same job for charities in Hertfordshire, IT support. This was 1968. It was called Project 70, gearing up to produce an online system. Well, it was a batch system, but they accepted information from the banks over phone lines, collected it all and ran it overnight. And then they had to be up and running the next morning, so it had to be done quite rapidly. A later job was working for a Systems Programming Limited as a consultant. I was working in Finland, and they had a Honeywell system that did transactions, which was the way that banking is now done. Something happens, it changes everything in the system. It updates the balance, calculates interest. And nowadays even PCs run on mouse clicks, which is an event, a transaction. In the previous days it was batch processing. You collect information, run it all through, get the answers, and then go round the whole loop again. In the old days, a transaction was everything that happened in a day. Now it's everything that happens in in a nanosecond if you go into the city, where they have very high frequency trading. I suppose the next big change was that I set up my own company, Mine of Information Limited, and that was in 1977. And the reason was that I couldn't afford to buy computer books, which are really expensive. They were like £30 each, which was a lot of money in those days. It's still a fair amount nowadays. I was also very keen on books, and I'd been helping in a bookshop, and I saw how bookshops operated. And then I realised that you could buy books, read them and sell them, which seemed to me a brilliant idea. So I bought and sold computing books, and there's usually one for display at exhibitions. So I'd read one and leave that out for other people to look at. There was quite a high turnover. It was mail order, one of the first in Europe, I think. That was from about 1977 to 1983, selling computer books by mail order. And round about that time, Prestel arrived. And I was putting pages of books onto Prestel, which were, I think, £40 a year for a page. And that seemed a good way to go. And then BT decided it would be £600 a year for a page, so that killed the market. But that's effectively where Amazon took off. They started selling books by listing them on a page. Their innovation was that they didn't stock anything. They just passed the order on to the publisher, who then shipped it, and they got a hefty discount off the publisher. And then Amazon moved on. I moved on, but in a slightly different direction, into consultancy. McDonnell Douglas was one company I worked for. They had a fascinating language called RPL, and there was one instance where it wasn't for McDonnell Douglas themselves, but it was a client using one of their computers. The system was called PIC, the operating system. And he had a customer in who was interested in getting a program written, and the boss told me that they were going off to lunch and gave me the design of the program, which was just to get some information in through the screen, accept it, regurgitate it in a different form, and keep records of what was happening and do summaries and what have you. He came back from lunch, the program was finished. The client couldn't believe it. He said it would take him 6 weeks to do. This was effectively database programming, which led into SQL in the end. Fortunately, programming's fairly well paid, so effectively I got to the end of my commercial career and decided it was time to do something beneficial rather than working for finance companies or arms manufacturers or whatever. So I got a job with the North Hertfordshire Council for Voluntary Service, and it was revolutionising computing for charities so that they could get on with their own primary job, which was something to help people or tortoises or whatever they were designed to do. And I found this fascinating, and the target was 20 charities to be helped. I aimed for 200, and I think I achieved 100. I was allowed 2 years, and it was supposed to be a 3-year project, so I think I did reasonably well. But I felt a lot more could be done. So when that contract came to an end, I set up my own company called Mine of Innovation Limited, which has been running for 5 years now. It effectively gives discounted consultancy and advice to charities and recycling computers, like a complete system for £50 with Windows 10. Found that people are very suspicious of anybody offering to help, and I don't blame them. You have to earn trust. So I started off with some of those people by saying, would you like a free computer? So eventually they said yes, and I delivered it and installed it and set it up and left them to it. And then a few months later they'd realised that it was a free computer. and maybe they could trust me, so they'd come back and ask questions, and then we'd form a relationship. It's a big topic, how things have changed. The Midland Bank computer occupied a size the area of a football field, and the main processor ran at 10 megahertz. Now that's a pathetic speed. You can get something the size of your watch that runs at a gigahertz. Computing is now intrinsic to society. So the first big change was integrated circuits, which have made computing universal, the Internet of Things. And the second big change was the Internet, of course. That was a huge change. That's essentially democratized knowledge. It's made it available to anybody who can access the Internet. And despite BT, that's becoming quite common. I wrote a UK payroll system, designed it, wrote it. I wrote the first British Othello program in machine code, published it in a newspaper on paper, the hex code. There must be lots of other things that I'm proud of. I found a bug in a hardware by testing at the bank again. This was Midland Bank. I had to write the 1970 conversion program from LSD to pounds and pence. And I tested it carefully and found that at a penny less than £100,000, there was a hardware error. It got the calculation wrong. So I then wrote a long division program in COBOL that was implemented in the software to avoid the hardware bug. I had a job which was Latin American support for Burroughs machines, and there are two of us supporting Mexico and associated Latin American countries except Brazil. And one of the instances I had to sort out was the Peruvian Navy. They had a small machine, as it turned out, which was working very hard on a tiled floor. And it was bouncing across the floor when it was driven hard. So one of my solutions was to put some carpeting under it, and also to try and smooth out the disk accesses. But while I was there, they had a revolution. The Navy was in charge of replacing the president. And when I turned up for work, there was a line of people behind hedges with guns. And I waved a British passport and said, "I'm British," and they let me through. And I did my work and came out again. I went back to the head office in Lima, and the shutters were down. So I went back to the hotel and phoned, and they said, "It's all right, you can come around the side entrance, it's open." It's a very common occurrence, apparently. I worked in the McDonnell Douglas building where they had the fire in Hemel Hempstead. I think the fire started in the lift shaft. We were 1 or 2 rooms away from that. And I remember the fire drill. We had to, when the bell went, we had to leave the building and go and stand by the fence next to the petrol tanks on the other side. I remember wondering at the time, is this sensible? It's just very fortunate that nobody died. I did a small project for, I think it was Data Point Limited, effectively building a fast food cash register where you press a button and it has the price stored and it adds it all up and then gives you the total. And this was based on a 6502 processor. There was one engineer and me, and we were just given a sheet of paper saying this is what we need to do. And the engineer went off and found the hardware, and I wrote the software. And the engineer had commissioned a circuit board, and off it went to be made. And then we had a demonstration that came up that we could not fault at all, we could not go wrong, nothing was allowed to go wrong. And the circuit board arrived back the day before, and the engineer was cursing in the corner, and he said, "They've built this upside down." So after we'd had a think and a panic, he took the chip that was the processor and bent all the pins the other way round and plugged it in, and it worked. Yes, I wrote the Othello program and took out a trademark, and part of that you had to do was chase up anybody who violated the trademark. And everybody was writing Othello programs, so I'd write to them and say, excuse me, you can't call it Othello. Reversi was an acceptable name. And one of the people that I found was Martin Brennan, who now does he does, I think, a device that collects CDs. He sells it in newspapers. He's an absolutely brilliant programmer, not just programmer, but hardware engineer. And he can design the software and hardware together. So we decided we'd cooperate on publishing this program, set up a company, Games of Skill Limited, and sold Othello, and it went through Sinclair Research, and we sold a fair number. He wrote it in C using artificial intelligence, alpha-beta pruning. So part of that was going to see Sinclair Research to talk about it. And one thing I particularly remember was that he came with me on an interview, and we saw Clive Sinclair. And then Clive Sinclair took Martin Brennan off my hands and got him to design components for the QL, Sinclair QL, which was the tape drive in particular. And that had error correction built into it because tape is not particularly reliable. Soon after Martin Brennan went to work for Sinclair Research, he asked if I'd be interested in a contract to write a word processor for the ZX Spectrum. So I said yes, and I was commissioned to do it. And I found that a very neat way of accepting key presses was to use a feature of the hardware which gave you hex FF, all bits. And I found a way of redirecting that so that I could get keyboard input and buffer it. So you could type as fast as you liked, and it would be buffered, and then it would come out again later on. If you didn't buffer it, then you'd miss key presses. So this made it quite fast, quite successful, and the trouble was that they then redesigned the hardware. And I phoned up the people and said, is it still going to have this double FF, the FF all bits feature? And they said, my goodness, we don't know. You know, why should you? Surely don't write programs like that. That's dangerous. My commercial career was going reasonably well, and I was consulting around the world, around Europe. And then I decided that family was quite important. So I took about 10 years off to look after children, besides doing contract work. And I found what many feminists have been saying, that it's very hard to take a break and get back in, because people want to know what you've been doing for the last 6 months. They don't care what you've done before. They want you to have done exactly what they want in the past 6 months. Otherwise, you don't even get past the first hurdle.